This is the story of one of World War II's most persistent myths, the claim that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel warned his generals about General George Patton's speed and tactical brilliance, only to watch those warnings get ignored. Chances are, you've heard some version of this tale floating around internet forums, military history discussions, maybe even casual conversations about the war, and it gets repeated so often that most people accept it as fact. The truth is simpler and more damning. It never happened. Historians examining German military records, intelligence assessments, Rommel's personal papers, staff officer memoirs, and post-war interrogations have found nothing, not a single document, not one diary entry, not a shred of proof that Rommel ever issued such warnings. The core problem runs even deeper than missing evidence because Rommel and Patton never actually faced each other in battle. What we're going to do today is dismantle this myth piece by piece, using documented history, examining the actual timeline of events, looking at what German records really say about Patton, tracing where this legend originated, and understanding why a story with no historical foundation became one of the most widely believed tales of World War II. This is a lesson in how myths get created, how Hollywood shapes our understanding of history, and why verifying the stories we think we know matters more than we realize. The popular myth. Let me lay out what the myth claims in all its variations across the internet, in books, and in conversation. According to countless retellings, Erwin Rommel recognized George Patton's genius for mobile warfare during their encounters in North Africa, then issued warnings to his fellow German commanders like von Arnim, von Rundstedt, and other generals about this dangerous American. Rommel supposedly told them Patton was different, that his speed and aggression made him a unique threat, that underestimating him would be catastrophic. Those other German generals were too arrogant or too stubborn to listen, dismissing Rommel's warnings and viewing Patton as just another American general, or perhaps underestimating the Americans in general. When Patton's armies came roaring through France in 1944 with lightning speed, breaking out from Normandy and racing across the countryside, these same generals who ignored Rommel's warnings paid the price. Everything about this narrative feels right, because it has all the elements of a compelling story, a respected opponent recognizing genius in his adversary, prophetic warnings going unheeded, eventual vindication when those warnings prove true. The story fits perfectly with what we know about both men, since Rommel was a brilliant tactician who understood mobile warfare, and Patton was aggressive and fast-moving. Both were tank commanders, both willing to take risks, and they seem like natural rivals matched across the battlefields of World War II. Just one problem: none of it happened. Before diving into what German records actually say, before examining specific dates and documents, we need to address the elephant in the room, because Rommel and Patton never faced each other in battle. Not in North Africa, not in Europe, never. This fact alone destroys any claim about Rommel warning people based on his experience fighting Patton, since you can't warn people about an opponent you've never faced. The actual timeline reveals just how impossible this myth really is. Both commanders were in the North African theater at the same time for exactly 3 days. And that bears repeating because the entire foundation of this supposed rivalry, all these alleged warnings, all the dramatic confrontations between two great commanders rests on a 3-day window. What actually happened goes like this. February 1943 brought Rommel his victory at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, a significant German win that taught American forces a harsh lesson in their first major engagement against German armor. But Rommel wasn't fighting Patton because he was fighting Major General Lloyd Fredendall's Second Corps, while Patton wasn't even in command yet. March 6, 1943, saw two things happen on the same day. With Patton arriving in North Africa to take command of Second Corps from Fredendall, while Rommel fought his final battle in North Africa at Medellin. Rommel wasn't fighting Patton's newly acquired command, though, because he was engaging Montgomery's British Eighth Army hundreds of miles away. 3 days later, on March 9th, Rommel permanently departed North Africa by flying to Rome and then to Germany, never to return to the theater, since Hitler recalled him officially for health reasons. though the Africa Corps was clearly in its final days. 2 weeks after Rommel left, from March 23 through April 3, Patton won the Battle of El Guetar in an American victory that redeemed them after Kasserine Pass. But Patton wasn't fighting Rommel's forces because he was engaging units under General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim while Rommel was already in Europe. During those 3 days of overlap in North Africa, there was zero direct combat between Rommel's forces and Patton's forces, since they were literally fighting different enemies in different locations. The question about Europe comes up naturally, since surely they must have clashed during the campaign in France, during Normandy, during the famous breakout and race across France that made Patton a legend. They didn't. July 17, 1944 brought Rommel critical wounds when his staff car was strafed by Allied aircraft, likely RAF Typhoons or Spitfires, causing severe head injuries that hospitalized him and ended his active command forever. Patton's Third Army wasn't officially activated until August 1, 1944, which was 2 weeks after Rommel was wounded. When Patton was racing across France, achieving those lightning-fast advances that became the stuff of legend, performing the mobile warfare that Rommel supposedly warned people about, Rommel was in a hospital bed and then recovering at home. Hitler forced Rommel to commit suicide on October 14, 1944, after implicating him in the July 20th plot to assassinate the Führer. And this happened before Patton's most famous achievements, including his relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge in December. The two men never met, never spoke, never commanded troops against each other in any engagement, which means the entire premise of Rommel warning people based on fighting Patton is built on a foundation that doesn't exist. What German records actually say. Now that we've established the impossibility of the myth based on timeline alone, what German military records actually say about George Patton becomes the next question. And this is where historian Harry Yeide's research becomes devastating to the popular narrative. Yeide published a book in 2011 called Fighting Patton, George S. Patton, Jr., Through the Eyes of His Enemies. But this wasn't a typical biography, since he spent years examining hundreds of unpublished German unit reports, intelligence assessments, telephone transcripts, war diaries, and post-war interrogations to understand what German commanders actually thought about Patton during the war, rather than what they said decades later. His findings destroy the myth completely. The Germans barely noticed him. German intelligence's first documented mention of Patton came in mid-May 1943, according to Yeide's research. Appearing in a report from Detachment Foreign Armies West, the German unit responsible for intelligence about Western Allied forces, which simply noted that Patton had taken command of Second Corps. Here's the problem with that timing, though. By mid-May 1943, Patton had already left that command since he was no longer leading Second Corps. And the German intelligence services were so uninterested in him that they didn't even notice he'd moved on. Yeide wrote something that should end this myth permanently, stating, "I found no indication in the surviving German military records, which include intelligence reports at the theater, army, and division levels, that Patton's enemies had any idea who he was when he took command of Second Corps. The Germans didn't know who he was, with no record of them tracking his movements, analyzing his tactics, or viewing him as a particular threat," which raises the obvious question of how Rommel could warn people about a commander the German intelligence apparatus wasn't even monitoring. Post-battle reports ignore him. Immediately after the war ended, German commanders who had fought in Tunisia were asked by the U.S. Army's History Division to write accounts of their experiences. And these reports were written in 1945 and 1946, when memories were fresh, before Cold War politics influenced narratives, before anyone had reason to flatter their former enemies. These reports ignore Patton entirely. German ground commanders who actually faced Second Corps under Patton's leadership didn't consider his actions particularly noteworthy, and they were actually critical in their assessments. German reports described Second Corps' attacks under Patton as hesitant, and noted that they missed great opportunities, which is the exact opposite of fearing his speed and aggression. The Sicily Campaign in summer 1943 brought Patton leading the 7th Army, but German commanders remained unimpressed as Major General Eberhard Roth, commanding the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, observed that the enemy, meaning Patton's forces, conducted his movements systematically and only attacked after heavy artillery preparation. Germans saw Patton as cautious and methodical during this period, not as the aggressive, lightning-fast commander of popular legend, though the Patton who would race across France was still a year away and Rommel wouldn't be there to see it. German intelligence during France. The later period, during the breakout from Normandy and the race across France, raises another question, since surely German intelligence was tracking Patton then when Third Army was achieving advances measured in miles per day rather than yards. They were tracking him, but not because they considered Patton special, since German intelligence tracked all Allied army commanders. What Yeide's research found, though, is that German commanders on the ground, the ones actually facing Third Army, were often more focused on immediate tactical problems than on who was commanding the forces attacking them. The German military was collapsing by late 1944 as they were retreating, reorganizing, desperately trying to establish new defensive lines, and in their reports and communications, the emphasis was on Allied material superiority with the endless tanks, the constant air support, the overwhelming logistics rather than individual Allied commanders who were rarely mentioned. When Patton was mentioned, the context was usually locating Third Army's position for strategic planning rather than any special fear of Patton himself. At this point, you might be thinking you've seen Rommel quotes about Patton, that you've read them, and you're right, because there is one verified quote from Rommel about Patton, exactly one. The quote appears in a book called The Rommel Papers, published in 1953, edited by the British military historian Sir Basil Henry Liddell Hart, who compiled Rommel's letters, military notes, and other writings. And the quote appears in Chapter 23 on page 523. Rommel wrote this: "In Tunisia, the Americans had to pay a stiff price for their experience, but it brought rich dividends. Even at that time, the American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces, although we had to wait until the Patton Army in France to see the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare." This is genuine praise acknowledging Patton's skill and his achievements, but notice several things about this quote that destroy the myth. First off, it's retrospective, since Rommel is writing about events that have already happened, looking back at Third Army's operations in France, rather than issuing a warning before those operations took place. Rommel wrote this in 1944, and it appears in his private papers, meaning this wasn't a briefing to subordinate generals or a warning delivered to von Arnim or anyone else, but rather Rommel's personal analysis, probably intended for his own records, or possibly for a future memoir. Most important is what this quote doesn't contain, which is any warning that was ignored, since there's no "I told them but they wouldn't listen," and no mention of other generals dismissing his concerns, just simple praise for what Patton had achieved. This represents the totality of verified wartime statements from Rommel about Patton, one paragraph of retrospective praise in private papers with no warnings to subordinates, no prophetic insights that went unheeded, nothing that resembles the myth. If Rommel didn't warn anyone, and if German intelligence barely noticed Patton during most of the war, where did all the German praise for Patton come from? And why do we have all these quotes from German generals calling him brilliant? Those quotes are post-war. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, many senior German officers were interrogated by American and British intelligence, who asked about various aspects of the war, including their assessments of Allied commanders. The U.S. Army's Historical Division commissioned German generals to write studies of campaigns and battles to get the German perspective. During these post-war interactions, many German officers praised Patton highly, and these are real quotes from real generals that need to be understood in context. Günther Blumentritt, who served as chief of staff to several field marshals, called Patton the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man of incredible initiative and lightning-like action, but this assessment was written for a U.S. Army historical study after the war ended. Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Armed Forces High Command, said, "He was the American Guderian. He took big risks and won big successes," making this statement during American interrogation after Germany's surrender. Heinz Guderian himself, the father of German panzer tactics, said, "From the standpoint of a tank specialist, I must congratulate him for his victory," giving this statement to his captors in 1945. These endorsements are impressive, but notice the context since they're all post-war, all retrospective, all statements made to the Americans after Germany lost the war. This creates several problems for using them as evidence of wartime German respect or fear of Patton, because first, these generals had years to think about the war, to analyze what happened, to develop their assessments, rather than making these judgments in the heat of battle, since they were making them with hindsight. Second, they were speaking to their former enemies. And Harry Yeide notes in his research that some of this post-war praise may have been influenced by former Wehrmacht officers currying favor when Germany joined NATO during the Cold War. West Germany was being integrated into Western defense structures in the 1950s when many of these accounts were published, giving former German officers incentives to build relationships with their new American allies. Third, praising a defeated opponent is a time-honored way of explaining your own defeat, since if you lost to a genius, it's less embarrassing than if you lost to an average commander, which means by building up Patton as exceptional, these German officers were implicitly defending their own reputations. None of this means the praise is insincere, since Patton was skilled and Third Army did achieve remarkable things, and the German officers probably did respect his abilities. But we need to understand that these post-war assessments are fundamentally different from wartime intelligence reports and combat assessments. One more quote appears frequently in discussions of German views on Patton, attributed to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who supposedly said he considered Patton a far more dangerous opponent than Montgomery. This quote appears in Cornelius Ryan's 1974 book, A Bridge Too Far. But if you trace it back, Ryan got it from General Gunther Blumentrit's post-war account, since Blumentritt was von Rundstedt's chief of staff, recalling a conversation or opinion from years earlier. What we have is a second-hand account filtered through Blumentritt's memory, published nearly 30 years after the war, about an informal opinion von Rundstedt supposedly expressed, which is very far from a contemporaneous wartime document. Even if von Rundstedt did hold this opinion, there is no evidence he was acting on any warning from Rommel, since von Rundstedt and Rommel had a complicated relationship, and by the time Patton was racing across France, Rommel had been relieved of command due to his injuries. We've established what didn't happen, so now let's talk about what did happen, and how a story with no basis in documented history became so widely believed. The answer involves several factors that came together over time through embellished biographies, a legendary film, and the echo chamber of Internet culture. Ladislas Farago's biography. A journalist named Ladislas Farago published a biography in 1963 called Patton, Ordeal and Triumph. And this book became a bestseller that formed the basis for much of the popular understanding of Patton's life and career. Farago had access to Patton's papers and interviewed many people who knew him, but he was also known for dramatic writing and, at times, loose standards for verification, since his later books included claims that were definitively debunked, and historians have questioned his reliability. In Patton, Ordeal and Triumph, Farago claimed that the Germans watched Patton's movements like rubbernecked spectators following a tennis ball at Wimbledon, creating a vivid image that suggests constant obsessive German attention to Patton's every move. According to Harry Yeide's research in actual German records, though, there does not appear to be an iota of fact behind this claim. Farago wasn't making up the whole story from nothing, since he was probably conflating different elements like the post-war German praise for Patton, the deception operations that used Patton as a decoy before D-Day, and perhaps some genuine instances of German intelligence tracking Third Army's position. What he did was present this as if the Germans were uniquely focused on Patton throughout the war, which the records don't support. Farrago's biography was widely read and trusted, establishing a narrative framework that subsequent authors and historians often repeated without verifying the underlying claims. The 1970 film. Franklin J. Schaffner directed a film in 1970 called Patton, starring George C. Scott in the title role. And this film was a massive success, winning 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Actor, while still being considered one of the greatest war films ever made. The film opens with one of the most famous scenes in cinema, as Patton stands in front of a giant American flag, delivering a profane and stirring speech to his troops. And that speech was based on real speeches Patton gave, though considerably cleaned up for even the permissive standards of 1970. Several scenes showed German officers discussing Patton, though, with one scene showing German generals analyzing Patton's tactics, expressing concern about his capabilities, treating him as a uniquely dangerous threat. These scenes are dramatic and well acted, serving the film's narrative purpose of building up Patton as a formidable opponent. But they're fiction, since the filmmakers invented these scenes to create drama and tell a compelling story. Millions of people saw this film, though, and for many, especially those too young to remember World War II personally, or who weren't deeply versed in military history, the film became their primary image of Patton and his relationship with the German military. Films are powerful because they create vivid, memorable images that stay with us, and when a film is as well made and acclaimed as Patton, it carries an air of authority since people assume that even if specific scenes are dramatized, the basic facts are right. One line from the film became particularly famous, as an early scene shows Patton reading Rommel's book on infantry tactics. Then, after defeating German forces, Patton yells, "Rommel, you magnificent bastard, I read your book." It's a great line, quotable and memorable, perfectly capturing Patton's aggressive confidence. But there's one problem since George C. Scott ad-libbed it. Patton never said it. The scene never happened. How many people know that, though, and how many people have repeated that line believing it to be historical fact, developing their understanding of the Rommel-Patton relationship based on that fictional scene? One more element feeds into the myth, which is Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception plan before D-Day. The Allies created an entirely fictitious army group called FUSAG, or First United States Army Group, with this phantom force supposedly preparing to invade France at the Pas de Calais, northeast of the actual Normandy landing sites. Making the deception convincing meant putting Patton in nominal command of FUSAG, because the Allies wanted the Germans to think Patton was leading this phantom army. And this seems to support the myth that Patton's reputation made the deception more credible. What actually happened, according to Harry Yeide's research, shows the Germans didn't conclusively identify Patton as FUSAG's commander until mid-May 1944, just weeks before D-Day, on June 6th. Even then, Yeide writes that his leadership of the supposed landings at Pas de Calais appears to have been incidental to the strategic conclusions the Germans reached. The Germans believed in the Pas de Calais threat for reasons that had little to do with Patton, since they believed it because it was the geographically logical invasion point, because the Allies had created extensive physical evidence of armies massing in southeast England, and because their own strategic assumptions led them to that conclusion. Patton's involvement helped sell the deception mainly because he was a senior general who wasn't visibly involved in Normandy preparations, rather than because the Germans had any special fear of him specifically. Over time, though, this piece of history got distorted as the fact that Patton was used in a deception operation got transformed into evidence that the Germans were obsessed with him, which fed the myth that Rommel had warned people about him. The Internet echo chamber. The final element in the myth's persistence is more recent, and that's the Internet. Military history discussions have exploded online since the 1990s, and especially in the last 20 years, through forums, YouTube videos, blog posts, social media threads with millions of people discussing World War II, sharing stories, repeating facts they've learned. This has been wonderful in many ways since it's democratized historical knowledge, letting people who would never pick up an academic military history book engage with these topics, while young people learn about World War II from their grandparents' generation. The environment has also created conditions where myths can spread faster than fact checks, though. As someone posts the Rommel-Patton story on a forum, other people read it and find it compelling, then repeat it elsewhere, until it's been shared thousands of times with each iteration, adding small details and each telling becoming more confident and specific. Here's the insidious part, though. The more often you see something repeated, the more true it feels, and psychologists call this the illusory truth effect. Since when we encounter a claim multiple times, we're more likely to believe it, even if we never see any actual evidence for it. Forum posts cite the movie. YouTube videos cite forum posts, blog articles cite YouTube videos, and each one is technically providing a source, but if you trace it back, it all leads to the same places, which are Farrago's embellished biography, the fictional film scenes, and post-war German quotes taken out of context. Very few people dig down to the primary sources like the actual German military records, the intelligence reports, the contemporaneous documents, and even if they wanted to, most of those documents are in German, archived in military history collections, inaccessible to the average person. This is why the work of historians like Harry Yeide matters so much, since he did the work that most people can't do by going to the archives, reading the documents in the original German, cross-referencing them, and reporting what they actually say. What they say doesn't support the myth. The irony is that the true story of how German commanders viewed Patton is actually more interesting than the myth if you understand what it reveals about military intelligence, wartime assessments, and how reputations are built. During most of World War II, German intelligence wasn't particularly focused on individual Allied commanders, since they were focused on formations, on identifying divisions and corps, on estimating strength and capabilities, which was practical military intelligence, asking where the enemy forces are, how many there are, what they can do. Individual commanders mattered less than you might think, especially as the war went on and Germany was increasingly on the defensive, because when you're being attacked by overwhelming force, the question isn't who's commanding this attack, but rather how do we stop it with the limited resources we have. Patton's reputation, such as it was during the war, was built gradually through his visible achievements, with his leadership in North Africa against Rommel's successor von Arnim, helping restore American confidence after Kasserine Pass. His rapid conquest of Sicily in summer 1943, racing Montgomery to Messina, made headlines, and his use as a decoy in Operation Fortitude suggested he was important, though this was more about Allied deception than German fear. The real foundation of Patton's reputation, both in German eyes and in history, came from Third Army's breakout from Normandy and the dash across France in late summer 1944, and these operations were genuinely impressive. Third Army advanced faster and farther than almost anyone thought possible, liberating vast stretches of France with relatively light casualties, while demonstrating the potential of mobile mechanized warfare in a way that vindicated pre-war theorists like Guderian and, yes, Rommel. This is when German commanders really noticed Patton, when his reputation solidified, and when Rommel wrote that one verified quote praising the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare. By then, though, Rommel was wounded and out of the war, meaning he couldn't warn anyone about something that had already happened, while the generals facing Patton in France weren't ignoring warnings but struggling with an impossible situation, fighting a defensive war against materially superior forces while their own logistics collapsed and their manpower dwindled. The myth imagines a dramatic scenario, with a prophet warning of doom, foolish leaders ignoring him, inevitable disaster, but reality is more mundane, though more historically important, with military intelligence, focusing on practical rather than personal factors, reputations built through visible achievements, and post-war memory shaping narratives. Before we conclude, it's worth stepping back and thinking about what this case study teaches us about how historical myths develop and persist. Myths often contain kernels of truth that make them plausible, since Rommel did praise Patton, just not in the way the myth claims. German officers did recognize Patton's skill, just not during most of the war. And Rommel and Patton were both brilliant tacticians and aggressive commanders, so the idea of them as rivals feels right, even if they never actually fought each other. These kernels of truth make the myth resistant to casual debunking because someone can say they've seen German quotes praising Patton, and they're right since those quotes exist, but the problem is the context and timing, not the quotes themselves. Myths are often more dramatically satisfying than reality, though since the true story that German intelligence barely noticed Patton until his visible achievements in France, that Rommel and Patton never met, that there were no warnings ignored, is less exciting than the myth. The myth has narrative structure, dramatic irony, prophetic wisdom, and hubris, punished while reality is messier and less poetic. Prestigious sources can give myths legitimacy, as the 1970 Patton film won the Academy Award for Best Picture, was critically acclaimed and popular, made by serious filmmakers, and when a source is that prestigious, we tend to trust it even on historical details, since we assume they did their research and wouldn't just invent things. Films are not documentaries, though even films based on real events, since their purpose is to tell compelling stories rather than provide accurate historical records. And the problem comes when audiences don't maintain that distinction. Myths fill psychological needs, since the Rommel-Patton myth serves several purposes by making World War II more personal and dramatic, suggesting that even enemies can recognize and respect each other's brilliance, providing a what-if scenario about warnings unheeded, and these are narratively and emotionally satisfying, which makes us want the myth to be true. Once a myth is established in popular culture, it becomes very difficult to dislodge, though, and even now, after spending nearly an hour laying out the evidence against this myth, some viewers will probably still believe some version of it. That's not a criticism, but just human nature, since we don't easily abandon beliefs we've held for years, especially when those beliefs are widely shared and feel true. This is why primary source research matters, why we need historians who do the unglamorous work of reading dusty documents in archives, why we should be skeptical of dramatic stories even when they appear in books and films, why verification matters more than repetition. Let me bring this back to where we started. The claim that Erwin Rommel warned his generals about George Patton's speed and tactical brilliance only to have those warnings ignored is an internet myth with no foundation in documented history, and it does not appear in peer-reviewed military scholarship, German military records, Rommel's papers, or memoirs written by Rommel's staff officers. The fundamental problem is simple because Rommel and Patton never faced each other in battle, as they were in the same theater for 3 days with no direct combat, and when Patton achieved his greatest victories in France, Rommel was wounded and out of action, while Rommel died before Patton's relief of Bastogne, before the final drives into Germany, before the war ended. Rommel did write one passage praising Patton's achievements in mobile warfare, a retrospective assessment in his private papers rather than a warning to subordinates. And German officers did praise Patton highly after the war ended in post-war interrogations and historical studies with the benefit of hindsight, and sometimes with political motivations. The myth likely originated from several sources, including Ladislas Farago's 1963 biography with its embellished claims, the 1970 film Patton with its fictional dramatic scenes, post-war German assessments taken out of context, and the echo chamber of internet culture where stories are repeated until they feel true. The real story that German intelligence barely tracked Patton during most of the war, that his reputation was built through visible achievements rather than prophetic warnings, that the Rommel-Patton rivalry is largely a post-war construction, is actually more revealing about how war is conducted and how historical memory is shaped. Both Rommel and Patton were remarkable commanders who deserved their reputations, even if those reputations are sometimes exaggerated, and both demonstrated innovative thinking about mobile warfare and aggressive tactics. The fact that they never actually fought each other is a historical accident, since had Rommel remained in North Africa a few more months, or had Patton arrived a few months earlier, we might have seen a genuine clash between these two. Masters of armored warfare. That clash never happened, though, and no amount of wishful thinking, dramatic filmmaking, or internet repetition can change that fact. The next time you encounter a compelling historical story, especially one with dramatic warnings ignored, prophetic insights dismissed, or poetic justice delivered, take a moment to ask where this comes from. What's the primary source? Who benefits from this narrative? And is it possible that a good story has overtaken actual history? In the case of Rommel warning about Patton, that's exactly what happened as a good story that felt right, that fit what we wanted to believe about these two commanders, that was dramatically satisfying, became accepted as fact, despite having no basis in the historical record. History is complicated enough without myths obscuring it, and the real stories, the documented, verified, authenticated stories, are dramatic and fascinating on their own. Rommel's innovative tactics in France in 1940, and in North Africa, Patton's remarkable drive across France in 1944, the technological and tactical evolution of armored warfare during World War II, these stories don't need embellishment. What they need is careful research, critical thinking, and a commitment to truth over mythology. And that's what separates history from legend, fact from fiction, and genuine understanding from comforting narratives. Thank you for watching.